Welcome to Prose and Cons, a podcast by writers for writers, brought to you by Precipice Fiction. Precipice Fiction would like to acknowledge the people of the Eora and Durag nations as the original custodians and storytellers of the land this podcast was created on.
Okay, I'm going to get close to the mic for this one.
Yeah, nice up close and intimate.
On a day not too dissimilar to today, yet at the same time somewhat extraordinary, 3 writers gathered together in a room, one room that spanned a very long distance. They did this not to write, but to talk. And then you can insert like some Hobbit music there, some quirky, happy, intimate, whatever music. Welcome to Prose and Cons, a podcast by emerging writers, for emerging writers, because sometimes we feel like prose and sometimes we feel like cons. Today, we are in fact talking about narration. It's a very broad umbrella, a very large tool, and we're going to start to break it down into some of its smaller tools and point out some of the nuances so that you can take advantage of them and play around with them as you want. I am joined here today by 2 other great people that you no doubt know by now if you have been listening. But if you haven't been listening, we'll introduce ourselves now. I'm here with James Healy.
Hello, I'm James Healy. I'm a freelance editor and writer of horror and science fiction. I'm known for cooling engines.
Yeah, you are. And then we got Alex Eldridge as well.
Yes, I am Alex. I have released a collection of short stories and been published in a few different places, most recently with my story Pool Etiquette in the Big Issue Fiction Edition for this year, and also, of course, in the New Mythic collection by Precipice Fiction.
Mm-hmm. And today I'll be your host. I'm Phoenix Raig, founder of Bent Light Writing, and what else have I done? I've got an agent, and yeah, I'm known for Enter Elias Schmidt, also in the New Mythic. And not here at the moment, they will be missed, are Matan Elul, another fantastic writer, English teacher over in Israel at the moment, Burnham, screenwriter extraordinaire over in Australia, as well as Paddy, Boylan, fantastic writer, and he who carries a vocabulary which I envy over in New Zealand. And yeah, today we're going to get into narration. It's a very big topic. Narration is a very large umbrella tool, and under it are many, many smaller tools, and within those micro tools, and you can find your own style and play with it. And today we're just going to start to breach the topic officially and see what comes up, but hopefully categorize it in ways that can start to highlight some of the nuances to readers so that you can start to, or to writers, so that you can start to bend it to your advantage as well, as opposed to it kind of getting the better of you in unknown, unconscious ways, which it is wont to do. So I'll start with a definition that I found on Google, which left me wanting. And I have my own definition, but definition according to Google: a person who narrates something. So already I don't like this definition because it uses the word narrates, especially a character who recounts the events of a novel or narrative poem. And then another one was one who tells a story. In a work of fiction, the narrator determines the story's point of view. And that one's a little bit closer. So with that, my own definition: the narrator is a tool to guide the reader's attention and, in a way, is the glue that holds the story together, serving at times as the space between your characters, the world, and you as the reader. So it's kind of the guide through the story, directing the reader's attention, where it needs to go in order for the events of the story to make sense to the reader. Do either of you have any things you'd like to add to that sort of definition?
No, not really.
Makes sense to me.
Easy. So within, like I said before, it's a very, like, narration is a massive part of storytelling. If not, it's like is storytelling more or less. So within this, we'll break this down into a few tools that we'll touch on today, namely the large stroke sort of types of narration you can find in a story. So with that, we have first person narration, and I'll get into some definitions here in a moment, but we have first person narration, third person narration, and second person narration. Second person is not encountered very often, but it is there. And then further within third person narration, we're going to break it down into third person omniscient and third person limited. And within limited, you can even get tighter or further away from the focal point of your narration. And we'll get that into a little bit. And I also wanted to give a disclaimer that, as always, with most things in writing, these rules are hard, but also pretty soft. So it depends on how well you can, in the end, it just depends on how well you can communicate what you're doing to your reader. If you want to get experimental, if you want to, like, once you know the rules, you can break them kind of. So like, if you want to pull away and get tight in one thing, mix first and third person narration, you're free to do so. The only thing is, if you can do, you want to make sure you can do it in a way that makes sense. So knowing the rules will help you bend the rules to your advantage, so you're communicating your story well to your reader without losing them and confusing them and taking them out of your story experience, because ultimately that's what we want to avoid, is breaking your story. But if you can keep the story and communicate it well, you're free to do whatever you want with these. So they're just guidelines. Before we go into some definitions, what do either of you two have any styles of narration that you find you gravitate towards?
Yeah, I'd say my default natural style is probably to third person close. So referring to characters in the third person, like he said this, he went to get a glass of water, whatever it is, but really very closely tied in with their actual thoughts and things, which is a little bit closer to first person in its way.
Yeah.
So that's kind of what I default to, but I use it less these days, I think.
Mm-hmm.
I'd like to say very much the same. Third person close, for the same reason, where you're right in on the character's thoughts, and I like to pull back only very little to imply stuff about the surroundings that perhaps the character doesn't realize. But lately I've been playing with first person a lot as well, and I'm finding there's a lot of things that are different that I quite like, and I quite like to write using those things as well. So very, very close for me between the two, which will be fair.
Right on. I actually do the same. As you were talking just now, Alex, I was like, yeah, I actually default to first person quite a lot, but then I just realized, no, it is just very tight third person, like,
yeah,
right in there. Basically first person, but the only difference is I'm referring to him as he or them as like their pronouns and just their thoughts, but it's limited to all that they know.
Yeah, it feels like kind of a natural thing to get at as an early writer. I think a lot of us gravitate towards that because it's like, well, I can talk about the things that I know about, and the things that I can say and I can speak on. But maybe, depending on who it was, and I don't want to put words in anyone's mouth, but like you might feel that the first person is a little bit too intimate at first. I know I kind of feel that sometimes. It just feels a little bit close, just a little bit too vulnerable maybe. So yeah, like, so third feels like that happy medium between those two distances.
It's interesting because I feel, and maybe when I started I felt the same, but now I kind of feel if I'm writing first person, the voice of the narration is the character, whereas if I'm writing third person, the voice of the narration is me, if you know what I mean.
Yeah.
I feel like I can get a lot more, I can play around and be a lot more flowery if it's first person, because I'm like, that's how this character would tell the story.
Yeah.
It's them, it's not me.
Yeah, for sure.
So there are already some definitions coming out here that maybe people are picking up on. So first person narration is the narrator is speaking from the point of view of the character, meaning you're referring to yourself as I, or the character refers to themselves as I. You're talking through their mouth. They're narrating the world to the reader, and you're viewing the world directly through their eyes. you're right in the body of your protagonist or whatever character you're writing from at that moment. And obviously, being inside the body of that person, you only have access to that person's thoughts. You only know what they know. You only see and hear and sense what they sense. So you're very limited in that sense. But as James said, it's very intimate. And it lends it. Each narration style comes with a set of tools that you then have access to, because having that access to that intimacy allows you to tell stories in some different intimate ways. Third person, you use the pronouns of the person, he, she, them, they, and you call them by name. If you can also call them by name, because you're standing outside of them, narrating their actions and what they're seeing and witnessing to the reader. And from there, you can break down third person. I'll do that in a moment. And then you have second person narration, where you, the reader, are experiencing the action and the narrator is narrating to you. So you do this, you see this, this is what you are witnessing right now. And you don't get that in a lot of books, although I'm sure it does exist.
Can I say, Phoenix?
Yeah.
I've actually been writing a story recently, and James has read it, that actually does use second person, and it's
right on.
It's a really, at first it's really strange, it's really weird to do it, but you actually fall into it very quickly, and like after you've done it for a while, you're like, wow, I can't believe this isn't more used. But it is this very specific thing, because there's a sense of almost dissociation, because you're talking to someone and you're essentially narrating to someone what happens, you're telling to them. So it's you are at arm's length, but at the same time it's almost this first person feeling.
Yeah.
I actually read another story recently that was about a person narrating their experience as a person of color, and it was in like you, and it was basically a like kind of a list of slights and things that they'd received through their life, and like taken individually, each one of them would have seemed very like small and minor, but when they're all put together and framed with that you thing, you really can feel like what that is like. So I thought that was a really, really cool use of that style for that.
You like second person narration is such a weird one. Anytime you're using you is such a weird one, because it's like,
yeah,
as soon this is kind of it's a paradox, you, in a way, because if you're reading a book in second person, it's about you, the reader, but as soon as you read it out loud, it's about someone else. So it's like you need to almost read it in your head for the narrator to be talking to you. It's a weird one.
Yeah, the context of it changes.
I've noticed kind of an unusual, it might be a kind of colloquial Irish thing, but we would often tell a story in terms of, you walk down the stairs and you came to two doors, and one of them looks like it's the entrance into the bar, and one of them just looks like a storeroom. And I think it is a way of bringing the audience into the situation in a certain way, for a purpose. If you're telling a story of, I walked down the stairs and I seen two doors, it's more about, like, let's say I took the wrong door and I got locked in the storeroom. That's more about like a mistake that I made. But if you're just telling it as in, well, you go here and you go there and it looks like this, and you think it's going to be this way, you're saying it's more the layout of the building that caused the problem.
Yeah.
So anyone would have done this. So I've noticed that it's almost it's a different way of telling a story that I found. Anytime I've written in second person, I've found that I kind of take it up a little bit easier, but just because we would probably do that in storytelling here in general. But exactly like Alex was saying, it does create a sense of disassociation after it's been done for a while. So I think it only works better short. I remember when I was in writing classes thinking of writing an entire novel in like the UI perspective. The facilitator of the course was saying, like, it's going to get really exhaustive after a while, because it creates a lack of connection to the character, if you know what I mean. So yeah. But
true.
Having read Keychain, I thought it was absolutely fantastic what you did in that, Alex, because it works. The disassociation works so well with what's taking place in the story. It was really, it worked really well. It was also really unnerving from like quite early on, which I thought worked so well.
Ah, thanks, man. Yeah, but as you said, I think, and I actually tried to do an extended version of that, and you're right. If you try and keep that going, it does you do feel the fatigue after a while. So yeah, I think you're right about that. Like that short burst is effective. But if you did try and extend it like a really long way, it can get a bit like, oh wow, this is a lot,
Yeah.
you know?
Yeah.
Do you think that exhaustion, does it come from the fact that, seeing as you're referring to you and the character is your reader that you're writing to in that moment, do you feel like you don't have much access to your character?
I don't know. It's so hard to pull out the motivations for why something is difficult to write. Because as you're writing it, it could just be like you're in a slumpy bit and it's not good, or you could just be it could be to do with the voice itself. I don't know. I'm not really sure. But
Yeah,
I
fair.
discontinued it. Like I was like, this isn't really working. But who knows? Maybe I'll go back to it.
I think certainly, like, I'm not sure about the writing aspect of it, but I do think from the point of view of reading it, I think it's something that becomes a little bit tiring, because I think it's an extra little bit of work that the reader has to do each time. For some reason,
okay.
You have to pass it through another loop, like another brain loop almost. It's like, oh, it's not them, it's you, which is like you know?
Yeah. And then I think it lacks a certain amount of connection to the character over time. Perhaps because they have to keep filling in, this is me, or in some way.
Yeah.
So yeah.
So it's more exhaustive from a reader point of view than a writer point of view. Is that what you're saying?
Perhaps, yeah. I don't know if
I
don't know anyone who's tried to write a whole story like that, or, well, Alex, I guess you were saying it did become tiring, but I think that even when it's finished, reading a whole story like that becomes tiring too. So I think it's just not a direction that a lot of people take.
So second person, places where you'll find a lot of second person narration and where it's proven to work very well, is in video games and Dungeons and Dragons. You have your dungeon master. They narrate to the players in second person narration because the players are interacting there in the story as well. So it's, you went down the stairs, you see this, it's narrated to the players like this. And part of the reason second person narration feels weird to me if I were writing it is because I don't have that reader with me in the room. So it's almost like I feel like I don't have consent. I don't know what they're doing. I don't know what they're thinking. In the Dungeons and Dragons, as well as in the video games, you have that immediate feedback, that immediate playoff. But obviously you can do it in books. It's just less common.
It sort of takes away a sense of agency as well, because you like, it's not like I'm doing this or they did that, and this is a person who is separate to me, the writer, or you the reader, but it's actually you're kind of forcing your narrative will on the person reading it, and they're like, oh, because though there's the disconnect might come from that. Well, no, I don't do that. I would do this thing, like. So maybe that's where the lack that disconnect comes from, because it's almost like it's almost an act of subjugation,
That makes sense.
Like,
did anyone ever read those choose your own adventure novels as kids? Yeah,
no, but that's
they're
one.
Fun. They're kind of like you read half a page and then it's like, do you go this way or do you go that way? Do you choose this or do you choose that? And then it's like turn to page 24 and stuff like that. They're fun. But
I'd love to do an adult one of that. But in that, like, there's that insertion of agency there. You know, like every now and then you get this little injection of like, well, what do you do? Do you want to do this? Do you want to do that? So in that almost brings the reader back into it and sort of closes that gap for a little bit. I don't know.
Yeah, so it's like one of the tools with second person, and one of the pitfalls with second person is you do have, if you're talking directly to the reader, there's an added intimacy you create for the reader by putting the story on them, which can be very potent. But at the same time, you risk creating a sense of dissociation if it doesn't pull them in and they feel too separate from it. Then it creates that, and that doesn't fly. So we'll just tuck into third person a little bit more. So within third person, this is one you see, it's used in a few different ways. So starting the most zoomed out and coming in, you have third person omniscient. So this is where the narrator is some entity. It doesn't matter what they are, but the point is they know all of the characters, they know what every single character is thinking, and they know what every single character is doing in any given moment. and they're only then choosing what to show the reader at a given time that is important for the reader to know in order to create tension, drama, and significance within the story. So it's up to them to choose which characters and which thoughts to highlight in order to best create the story for the reader, for them to understand the events that are unfolding the best. Zooming in a little bit more, you have third person limited. So this is where you're still third person, like we were saying before. You refer to them as their pronouns, you refer to them by their name, you're not using I language, but at the same time you're limiting your perspective to whatever character you're focusing on in a given scene. You're limiting yourself to what that character knows. You only know their thoughts, and you don't necessarily know what's going on in the scene around them. Now, another thing to me, it kind of seems like these are used a bit interchangeably, and maybe you two know otherwise, but third person limited and third person tight. I tend to use the word tight when I'm referring to third person, like getting in on someone's thoughts, even though you're in third person. Do you guys know of a difference between limited and tight? The definitions I found are also pretty similar.
Not precisely. I would assume that they are somewhat interchangeable in terms of like you can move between them, like not just at random, but like if you want to really like zoom in on someone's thoughts, you could probably do that without being too like head hoppy. But I don't know if there's a technical definition between them.
They feel the same pretty much, I guess. Yeah, the tight is just that you're in close, and the limited is just that you aren't far away.
Yeah.
So just seems the same.
That's kind of how I felt it too. Like one thing I could see from definitions is it's like third person limited is almost like third person. I'll start with third person tight is almost like it's essentially first person, but instead you're using he, him, they, she, and their name. But that's the only difference. Otherwise, it's more or less the same. You're talking about what they're sensing, feeling, seeing, thinking, and they don't know what's going on in other person's heads, and the narrator is not divulging what's going on in other person's heads. That's what I would describe as tight. Limited, you could maybe argue is just pulled back a little bit further, where maybe you know the thoughts of the people in the scene, but you're limiting thoughts from people that aren't in the scene. But at the same time, that's a weird way to say it, because it's obviously like the scene is the moment of focus, so you wouldn't jump to someone else that's not in the scene really. Otherwise, they're in the scene. But it just seems like limited is kind of used in a way that it hints a little bit further out. But at the same time, it's a bit wishy-washy. Limited, tight, you could think of it the same way as far as I'm concerned. You have my permission. Take that with whatever authority you want.
It's I always find that I remember like going to the writers group that we all met in, with Jack and everyone in there. And I remember the first couple of things, it wasn't, I don't think it was my work. I think it was someone else was reading something. And I heard this term head hopping, which is like jumping between people's perspectives like rapidly so that it's jarring. And that idea that you wouldn't want to move between characters too often, I think really hamstrung me a lot early on in terms of my use of, say, omniscient, which I think is I don't want to say superior, but it certainly like lends a lot of versatility and freedom into what you can do. So just redefine, I'm refreshing that definition. Basically, omniscient is where everyone knows everything at all times. And it doesn't mean that it necessarily has to be way out and you're like, well, I can just see these two people over here and I can only, you can kind of jump into figuring out what they're saying, but there is a certain level of remove from it. And I was always really scared to do that because I was like, well, how do I know how close is too close? But I don't know. I think that's a mode that I want to move towards. Like I forget who said it, but basically it's like it's this. No, it was Richard Russo. It was Richard Russo. He's got this really good essay called "In Defense of Frogs," where he talks about John Steinbeck and his basically talking about like the dance between hunters and frogs. And describing how the frogs would they'd like run away and like the hunters would try and get them, and like there would be this like the frog has to wait till the last minute to get away, and he's just sort of describing this in loving detail. And it's sort of like being able to use the omniscient thing to speak to something that you don't know from experience. You know, it's hard to do a third person close perspective on frogs. Because unless you're like really inhabiting that and it's like a children's story and you're like, no, the frog did this, you can just kind of do this little zoom in thing and be like, well, the frog thought this and this and this, but then you can kind of move back. So it gives you a little bit more freedom of, more motility of perspective, I guess is a good way of thinking of it. So I always try and make use of that in bigger works if I can these days, just because I think there's more freedom in it.
Mm-hmm. I think it was our group talking, and we were talking about people that have been writing for longer and maybe have a little bit more agency in the craft of it. They tend to employ third person omniscient a bit more versus people that are just starting might gravitate towards first person. Yeah. We were talking about that. And I remember when I first heard that, I was like, what? Like, I would think it'd be the opposite, because I feel like first person's so much harder because it's so limited. But as I'm going, I'm actually seeing, like, I've actually come to appreciate how difficult omniscient is to pull off as well as pull off well. And I thought the opposite, because in omniscient you have so much freedom, but because you have so much freedom, you have to pay extra attention to how you're talking in a given moment, because you can create something. So one common mistake that I see, like editing stories with third person narration, is what I'm calling now third person dissonance. And it's where you technically have, seeing as you have freedom to be in anyone's head at any given time, there's nothing wrong with you saying in a given moment that someone's thinking, like talking from someone's point of view, and then divulging the thoughts of another person that you weren't currently talking for. There's nothing stopping you from doing that. But you need to be, in third person omniscient, you need to be strategic with how you do it, because if you do it at given times, you can pull the reader out of the story, because there are certain moments where it might come across a bit odd. And I'll give a little example here. Well, it's kind of a pseudo example. I'll just elaborate on what I mean. If you're really tight to someone's perspective, if you're third person omniscient and you choose a moment to become really tight to someone's perspective, so you're zooming in on a character to give their thoughts and perspectives. But then, okay, we'll give an example here. So I'm editing a story right now where the character, there's a son and a mother character, but the narration is more or less omniscient. It's pretty tight. It's tight in a lot of scenes, but it's omniscient. It knows what every character is doing all the time. There are moments where the narration will get really tight to someone's point of view, specifically the son's point of view, but then refer to the mom as Rose. And every time it does it, it pulls me out a little bit, because I feel like I'm thinking and viewing the world as the son at that moment. And in those moments of closeness to the son's perspective, it should be referred to as my mother, their mother. And because we're really close in on the son. So we're looking at the world from that perspective. In those moments where the mom's name is dropped in, we suddenly come back out into the narrative point of view. And it kind of creates this jarring experience of, suddenly the tightness is undone and we're in the narrator's voice. And so it creates this little bit of dissonance, this weird sort of feeling. There's nothing stopping you from doing it, but it pulls away from the experience of a little bit. And it's those little like weird subtleties that you have to pay extra close attention to in third person. Otherwise you can run into some weird things. Another thing that's really, this isn't necessarily like something that can happen that's wrong per se, but it's something to really watch out for. In third person narration, the narrator has more of a presence as an entity in the story, because you're not writing I. So you're not writing as I. So in first person, your narrator is your character. In third person, the narration takes on a shape of its own. There's this external force that's recounting the events of the story. In these moments, the narrator is your voice of truth. So your narrator is very tightly married to your voice as an author in these moments. And it's in these moments that you need to pay extra close attention, because sometimes, especially when you're talking about events that are difficult to talk about, moments of racism, sexism, things that are like really like, they're not easy to look at, but they are worth exploring in texts. But it's in these moments that we need to very closely watch the language we're using, because we want to make sure that the reader knows that the voice of the narration is separate from the voice of us as an author, because we might be portraying an event of intense racism or intense sexism or something like this. The characters might be talking a certain way. We want to make sure that we're showing the reader that these are the characters and not us, the author, that has this voice. And that's an art in and of itself. But typically it manifests by, if a moment of racism is presenting itself, you want the character, the voice of the character, to be giving that. And then if you pull out into narration, you want to make sure that your voice is absent of that. You want to show, that's where you want to show your perspective and show that separation. And that way, you know, the reader will know that they're safe reading this material because they know that the author themselves is not racist or sexist. They're just portraying these moments so that we can explore them in a safe space. And that's the difference between reading a book that was written in the 1700s, where you find actual racism and sexism and things like that, or, you know, happens more recently, sadly, versus a book that explores that today, where we ourselves are conscious of these things and we're evident. We want to create that safe space to explore these. And it's just these little things that people need to keep in mind in third person, because you do have more of an authorial presence in the world as having your author as kind of the narrator. So you just need to watch how you're using your voice. And there's a bit more subtlety. There is a lot of freedom. And in that freedom, you need to be very aware of the subtleties in order to properly create the experience you want your readers to have. And it just is a little bit more nuanced as you go.
That was fantastic.
Oh, thank you.
That was fantastically well put. Absolutely, yeah.
Oh, I'm glad.
That's really, I totally agree with that. That's really like summarized like a lot of stuff that I've been, I guess, trying to figure out through writing, which like I wish I just had someone say it to me, so I could have saved so much time. But
I'm certainly glad we recorded it.
Yeah. Yeah, I've definitely found when writing about either difficult things or writing from the perspective of a character who has some kind of extreme or some kind of unpleasant view, I find writing the first person, it's a lot easier to write about that and feel like you're doing it in a way which is, like you're saying, just safe and is just like more appropriate. Whereas writing the third person point of view, even if you're getting very close, like you said, there is still that authorial voice that you're writing with. Like your narration is still like the voice of truth, so you kind of can't do it in that sense. So that was so well put.
Yeah, it's just a matter of dropping. I see it as it's a matter of dropping little hints. Like you zoom in on your characters and explore something, and then when you take a moment where you kind of step back and embody the voice of the narrator a little more, and in those moments you just drop little hints. You have little things in your voice that show the reader that it's like we're exploring these events, but ultimately we're doing this through the lens of what we know today and the consciousness that we have in our society and the awareness we have around these events. So like, it's all right. Like I, the author, am here with you, but we're going to look at these things, and it's a matter of portraying that. So off of this, I wanted to go a little bit more fine grain into some of these. So a few weeks ago, James did an episode on the unreliable narrator. And so you can break these tools down even more. So it's like you have these first, second, third person narrators. And then within those, you can create a bunch of varied styles of narration. And some do resurface multiple times and they're fun to look at. So one is the unreliable narrator. I'm not going to get too much into that because we have a whole episode on it. Another one is narrator as a character in the story. So the narrator themselves is someone that is walking on the streets or something. Like they're a character that can be interacted with by the other characters, but it is a third person story. But your narrator has an actual presence in the story. They just might not be kind of interacted with very much. They might be an observer of some kind. And then you have the more kind of this one's more vague, but just narrator as an invisible guiding force. So something like The Lord of the Rings, the narrator in that book has no presence. You don't see them. And the result is you just kind of feel like a presence just kind of flying through the events of the story. And in those styles of narration, when the narration is done well, you're not even really aware of the narrator. You don't even feel them, but that's narration done well in that case. You don't want to. So off of this, I wanted to ask, are there any books, any things you guys have read, any like fun twists on narration style you've come across, any cool gimmicks or just anything that caught your eye, I guess?
I particularly liked I really liked the story by Stephen King, Under the Dome, which is a story where a small American town just gets encapsulated by a massive glass dome.
Yeah.
Havoc ensues. But the narration of that is, there's like 30 characters. The narration jumps from character to character, but he's very comfortable and very self-aware and almost self-referencing in that he is acknowledging, now we're going to jump around to all of the different characters or a bunch of different characters' reactions to this thing happening.
Whoa.
People and animals who were sort of at the edge of the dome, and did something get detached as it came down, or did someone see something? And it kind of acknowledges, through the magic of, I don't know what he says, but through the magic of multiple perspectives at once, we're right back where we started and no time has passed. Later on in the story, he describes you and me as the viewers of this story are going to whoosh down the street to the next character. Barely, our passage like lifts ruffles of newspaper or swings a branch or something. So you get the sense that you are a ghost or some kind of disembodied presence being guided through the story by this other presence, which doesn't like play a role in the story. It was just a really fun way of switching between things and narrating and guiding you from one place to the next. And you felt very, like you're saying, you just felt very guided and very taken care of. And you were just like, sure, yeah, we'll jump to this and jump to this, and there's a purpose for everything. It really lended to the writing I found.
I feel like you can have two styles of that kind of narrator. Like there's the Lord of the Rings style that you described earlier, Phoenix, where it's very, I describe it as transparent, where there's just, you don't get the sense of tone that that comes with it. It's just like, I'm just telling you the event. Well, not even I'm just telling you the events. The events are being told to you and you are seeing it from a distance, but still without, any sort of overlaying, feelings or impressions. And then the other kind is what I call like the Mark Twain version, where it's like told through this like, like a maybe a wizened old guy who's like telling you this story with a wink and a nod, and you can tell that it's being filtered through their impressions. The person who does this really well is the guy who I just mentioned before, Richard Russo, who wrote that essay. And it's all like the tone of the way it's told alone kind of puts it into this like comedy-esque sphere. Like it's not, you wouldn't say it's comedy because it is literary. Like the guy won like a Pulitzer for one of his books, Empire Falls, which is like one of my favorite books of all time. But it is like there's this sort of like wry amusement at most of the things the characters are doing. It's like like there's this one thing that he mentions in the essay where it's like they're talking about like the saber-toothed tigers, the Schuyler Springs saber-toothed tigers, which is a football team. And they're like, there's this whole furore whether it should be the saber teeth or the saber tooths. And someone's like, well, we can't call it saber tooths. That's not a word. But like, then he's like, saber teeth just sounds like finicky and dental. Like, and he uses the word, and it's just a like it acknowledges the fact that like this is being told from the perspective of a person, and there's the whole thing's just got this sense of like, I'm pulling your leg a little bit here. This is kind of fun, but it is a tone nonetheless. It's not like pretending to just be like a God's eye thing, just looking down and you're just seeing it as it happens. So yeah, I feel like those are the two distinct styles. At least with Omniscient, it's much harder to do that with close. I'm not even sure you could do it with close narration, like because it's so like colored by the sense of the character themselves. Do you know what I mean?
I think so. Like you're not sure if you could actually. Could you
I'm not sure if. Well, I'm not sure if you could convey the sense of tone, the sense of authorial tone, in the same way from a close perspective, because it becomes then the character's tone. Like you can't really do close, but also being told by this extra voice. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
I feel like they're almost either or. It's like zero sum.
I fully know what you mean. And that's actually something else that I see pop up in, that's another like nuance of third person that takes a bit of skill / it could also be something that you bump in with first person. Anytime you're close, really tight on a character's perspective, and you start getting like, let's say, very flowery with the prose, like very poetic and very or like describing fine detail. When you're in an omniscient point of view, you kind of have free license to do this, because it's kind of known that you're this external force that's just describing things and painting pictures, and that's pretty fine. But when you're tight on a character's point of view, if you're in first person, it's a bit easier, because it's like you can use it artfully, like someone having a conversation and dissociating from the conversation, and the the character starts describing a candle that they're sitting next while they're hearing the conversation. It's like, that makes sense. But I've noticed there are some moments where, I guess it would be in like tight third person, where you're very tight to a character's perspective and you're walking through the town. And I notice that the author's just pointing out like the characters noticing a lot of very fine detail. They're doing that like picture painting that you would normally do like a bit further out from the character's point of view. And I guess when you're doing that picture painting very close to a character's point of view, you kind of then need a reason for that character to be noticing those things. And if you don't have a reason for that character to be noticing those things, it's like, whoa, I think I've pointed this out to a reader before. It's like, this character is very aware of these curtains. Like, why are they so aware of like all the whatever?
And they have to be like autistic or something, like have some reason to be like, the fabric felt like smooth against my skin, which I noticed at the time. Because that's what the sort of thing I noticed. I have to not to cut you off, but I have to say one thing about first person that really annoys me sometimes is I'm not a terribly in my writing, I'm not a terribly strong with interiority. Like, I get told all the time by my girlfriend, she's like, what do they feel about this? Why do they need more? Like, because she's my number one editor. But it does annoy the heck out of me when something is just like really internal and really angsty and like, oh, I felt like this, and then it just goes on and on, like it might even be a product of the character themselves, because they might be this sort of like okay, like a bad version of the Hunger Games, where it's just this like 17-year-old like YA protagonist, and they're like, and I don't want to dump on that specifically, but like, if there's too much interiority about what's going on, I get bored very, very quickly. I want to see things happen and things moving in the story, even if they're small little things, like even if it's just how someone's fingers move across the keys, or like the subtle glance that they give. Like, I want to see actions taking place as opposed to have feelings described to me. And that might just be a personal taste thing, but yeah, that really gets my goat.
It definitely happens. Like, I feel it when I'm reading as well as when I'm writing. If I'm doing too much interiority, I get this feeling of like stiffness, and it's like, all right, just let the thing fly, let it run. Like, time to open up the gates a little bit. Like, let's see what happens. I'll dump on Frankenstein for this. That oh my gosh, the pages and pages of, it's like, I get it, you feel bad about this, you feel guilty. But it's like every interaction that character has is immediately reflected through the lens of his anguish, like just profound anguish. And it's like, we get it, you're in a lot of anguish, but everything, I'm all for like painting the world through a very particular lens and setting up that tone, but it's just reflected through everything that passes, every moment that passes, he reflects it again, of just how twisted the thing felt, how the songs of birds fell mutely on his ears, or whatever it is. It's because of the anguish, and he just like hammers it in so hard and maybe, you know what, this could not have been the intention, but if it was, it's very artful. But it added to the empathy or the sympathy that I felt for Frankenstein when we did start, or for Frankenstein's monster, when we did start to get narration through their point of view, because he was happy about the world, and I was just like, oh my gosh, thank you. Okay, we're curious about things are new, things are fresh. Huh? You didn't
I
make it
never
that
even
far.
made it that far. I've tried to read Frankenstein like 3 or 4 times, and I can't with the language.
Really?
Like, I'm sure it's a
Wow.
great story,
Wow.
but it's just a bit too much for me. Like, you can tell it's written by, what would she, like 18, 19? Like,
Oh, I don't know actually.
I think she was quite young when she wrote it.
Okay.
And yeah, I'm sure it's a great story, like, all told, and maybe I need to get to the end of it, but just about halfway through, I just like get that fatigue, and I'm just like, I can't do this anymore.
Yeah, look, it's one of those stories that, like, when it came out, I'm sure it was really big. But I was actually thinking while I was reading it, because I'm also struggling to get through it. I feel like if it wasn't such a well-known story, because it's like everyone knows what Frankenstein is, like everyone knows what happens, everyone knows blah 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 blah. If I actually didn't know what was going to happen, I didn't know where this was going, and it was the first time I was reading this, I'd be pretty like, man, this is fucked. Like, this is crazy. And like, it'd be a bit like there would be suspense. But now I find myself like, it's a bit of a slog.
Yeah.
And I just find myself like, all right, let's just get to the end. Let's see what happens. Blah, 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 blah.
Yeah, I guess that makes sense. If you know where the story's going and then it's taking a long time to get there,
Yeah,
that's challenging. I think I read it as a teenager, so my memory of it is probably, it's been a long time since I read it, but I remember thinking like, deadly, absolutely. But I think it was quite adult, so I think it probably would have been quite a bit more intense than a lot of the stuff I'd have been reading at the time.
Yeah, it's like the writing isn't bad. Writing isn't bad. I don't want to suggest that, but it is a lot. Like, what it does, it really like hammers to death. It kind of beats a dead horse with the romantic anguish, like, which I guess is what Gothic literature is. And you combine that. Okay, so you compare that to something like, and I'll bring this back to perspective, Phoenix, because I don't want to like derail the conversation. You combine that with something like the beginning of Dracula. That, I think, is my favorite. Definitely my favorite piece of epistolary literature, as in like using letters to tell a story. Without a doubt, it's superlative. But even as like a horror story, it's just amazing. And it's told from this like just this very like tight first person. It's actually very similar, the style, but it's much subtler. It's a much subtler telling of that sort of thing, and the dread just slowly creeps in. You're not hammered with it. It's not immediately apparent that like weird, spooky stuff is going to happen. It takes a while to get there. But when it does, when that final thing where he's at the gates and Dracula's like, you can go anytime you want, and he's just standing there, and the wolves are out there, and you just know that it's just such a gut punch. I was like, oh man, brutal.
Yeah. Anytime that Dracula's like wives were involved, those things,
terrifying.
That was eerie as. That was so, that unnerved me.
That.
Yeah, Dracula's original Dracula,
man.
Bram Stoker.
Yeah. It's incredible
Great stuff.
Have either of you read Anne Rice's Interview with a Vampire series?
I haven't.
No.
They're very good. They might be a happy medium between romanticizing and stuff also happening. So that might be. I think you might like that. I think that they're my, what's the phrase when? They're like my ultimate vampire lore thing. Like, whenever I think of vampires, I think of them, and I'm like, that's the way vampires should be done. I think that's the best.
Yeah,
I can't remember what that phrase is, but they're the pinnacle of like vampire lore.
They're
the platonic ideal. Yeah. Cool. I'll have to check those out.
I just want to, so we touched on one other thing that I just wanted to highlight a bit more. Alex, I think you called out head hopping. Do you just want to quickly highlight what that is?
Yes. So this is something I've struggled with for quite a while, because I actually really do like to move between perspectives, like not usually within the space of a scene. I'm very reticent to do it within a space of a scene. Like, I was basically taught, like, if you want to go from one character's like perspective to another, basically what you have to do is like have one character, have them talking and doing whatever they're doing. They meet another character. There's this intermediary space where they're both there together, and it's like, oh, we are the perspective of sort of the room, and then maybe the other person leaves, or it's just very apparent that the action is now on this second person, and then you leave it from there. But it's not this thing where you're going, oh, he felt like this, and he was thinking this, oh, but then he thought this and was doing this sort of stuff. You have to be very careful, I think, not to jump between perspectives in the sense of like, who is the camera on? That's the best metaphor, I think. Like, who is the camera focusing on here? what about their experience are they taking in? Like, you have to be careful not to be shifting back and forth between them. You can have a dialogue between two people, but we need to know whose experience is being reflected in this moment, you know?
Mm-hmm.
And I don't think you can jump between them too quickly because it's disorientating. That's what head hopping is. And I don't know, I've always tried to avoid that where I can. If anyone's got an example of something where I think especially with close stuff is the main thing. Like, you don't want to be like, I thought I thought this, you know, that really close third standard where it's like you're hearing their thoughts essentially, and then you go and you hear someone else's thoughts essentially. I think doing that would be like full on head hopping, if that makes any sense. Omniscient is maybe a little bit more flexible, but yeah.
It comes across very subtly, I find, or like one example of head hopping that's very subtle that to watch out for in tight third or in first person would be if your character describes something subjectively from the other person's point of view. So it's like, I watched her drink the water gladly or whatever. It's subtle stuff like that. It's like, well, you don't actually know what they're feeling when they're drinking that water, and this isn't the best example, but it invites you to instead describe that more from the perspective of where you're writing from. So it's like, she drank the water with a look of gladness on her face. It's like something, and it's basically, it's kind of cheeky. It's like your way of telling the reader she's glad about it, but without actually saying it outright, because you can't technically do that. But by hinting at it, you're basically communicating to the reader, yes, this is the tone I want you to take away from this moment, blah. And you can use that in various ways, whatever, there's a whole thing there. But that's an example of head hopping or bleeding experiences. Yeah.
Well, like with that, what you're doing is you're because humans are very perceptive, you know, like we're really good at seeing what's happening. So if you're describing it from someone's point of view, and you say something that communicates that the perspective character you're describing sees her, let's go with drinking the water, and notices like she lapped at the water with a feverishness that I could and imply that this is very much the perspective of this person. But it's really obvious to everyone in the room, this person's stoked about drinking the water.
They're pretty happy about it.
Yeah, exactly. That's how you can get around it. But it has to be framed from the perspective of whoever's there. You can't be talking about someone else and then suddenly be talking about someone, because if you read that, and I couldn't like quote anything specifically, but if you read that and like you do that, like, and it just goes from one to the other and back, it becomes very disorientating. You're like, wait, where am I? Who is this about? Like, and you get this real sense of like dislocation. And you might even be able to use that as a literary tool, but it's one of those things that it's like in the right hands. You know, that would be like a pretty advanced technique, I'd say. It would have to be very intentional.
What you almost want to be doing is trying to character build the character whose perspective it is. So it's like she drank the water down rapidly, and then you have the character notice, is her hand shaking? Is there this? Or like then asking like, how long has it been since she's had some water? And then how do they feel about the fact that she hasn't had water in a while? Are they kind of like whatever about her? Or are they sort of like concerned? Or are they sort of this? Or are they sort of that? So you just color it in a little bit, and then you kind of move on. So you know exactly whose perspective it's in. And the reader isn't even then massively focused on the fact that you're trying to fill them in on the fact that the character's thirsty. They're focused on what are we trying to learn about how the character feels about the fact that they're thirsty. So you've kind of slipped it in that way.
Yeah. The other thing I was talking about before about like third person dissonance is kind of close to head hopping, but not quite. But I guess what I would say a good way to, if you're in third person omniscient, the thing I've picked up on recently that kind of helps with head hopping a bit, like if you have multiple characters in a scene, but you are omniscient, so you do have access to all their thoughts and feelings, and you're playing out the scene and you do want to change perspectives throughout, this is an area where I find the art of the paragraph comes in handy quite a bit. So a paragraph, formal definition, it's something we don't think about. A lot of people are tempted to just do text breaks kind of where they feel them. But it's important to really consider your paragraphs and think like, because a paragraph is a collection of sentences they're collected to convey an idea. So it's sentences that are brought together for a reason to convey a certain chunk of information. That's your paragraph. And it's when you have then you've communicated that idea and you have a shift in your idea or a change in that idea, or you want to add to that idea, that's when you might have a text break to then jump to the next paragraph. We're now building on this idea. Paragraph breaks are a great, easy way to kind of consider moments to change perspective if you wanted to. You've taken your moment, tight on one character, giving their perspective, conveying that idea, and then paragraph break, you shift to another person's perspective because now you're conveying a new idea. But it's that separation, that hard separation between the ideas so that the reader can kind of clip along with you. It's still not the easiest to do, and you can still get jarring, and so you do want to watch it. But if you're kind of trying to navigate those scenes, that's something you can use to kind of help yourself measure it a little bit.
Yeah, and you can also use a good metaphor, I think, for it is the changing camera angle. Like you have a scene where you're focusing in on someone's, you can just see their hand, and their hand is just like tapping rapidly or something, and then then it maybe goes to someone else's face, and that could be an example of the paragraph. Obviously, it's not one-to-one because writing and film are very different, but yeah, that paragraph change is the sense of the camera's focus shifting to something else, whether that be another character or whether that just be something happening, like something changing within the context of the character, your perspective character.
Yeah, like what you said before, like the character leaving the room. You kind of have a moment where a direction is given. Something is like we kind of pull off for a second, and then we come back into perspective, and you're on the other character.
Yeah, exactly. There's and there would be the paragraph, like there would be the paragraph of the person talking to someone or entering the room, and like the other person being there. Then you have the paragraph of those two people together, and that's sort of this midway point. And then maybe the other person leaves, and you focus in on that new character's perspective, and that's a pretty elegant way to change between perspective like that. Yeah, definitely can be done, but you just need to be careful about it.
Yeah, one, it can be jarring. Another thing, you might accidentally kind of uncoil the tension you've built. If you're jumping too much and giving too much insight from other characters, you might accidentally dissipate the tension you've built because the reader has too much information or something. Sometimes there's reasons to be tight. It's helpful to limit information at times. So if you're constantly giving everything and jumping around too much, everything's kind of too spread out, it can get kind of meaningless because you're kind of pulling that tension away.
I've noticed that even just from writing a story that has multiple characters, you're sort of trying to create a sense of direction or a sense of tension or a sense of something with one character, but then you have to jump into another character and their journey is a little bit different. I find you build up steam, and then maybe I'm just picking the wrong time to switch, but I find I run out of that steam very quickly and then have to start remember that this character is dealing with this and he's going to try to pick it up again. So it's too many characters can kind of spoil whatever tone you're trying to create or whatever pacing I guess you're trying to work into a story.
The story I'm writing right now is third person limited, and it's really tight on everyone's perspective, but I only change characters when the chapter changes. Every chapter is tight on a particular character and it stays within that whole chapter, and because of that it's really easy to organize and kind of I build the tension through that character, through that chapter, and then kind of end their journey for that particular chapter on a bit of a cliffhanger, and then you jump over to another character and you build that tension. So it's like this kind of up down, but then when you come back to the character during another chapter, when you revisit that same the character from before, I don't know, it creates a teasing effect, because it's like,
it's the Goosebumps effect.
Oh, is that I never read Goosebumps. Is that?
Oh, it's not really, but that's what I call it. It's like the ending on a cliffhanger, and then I mean, he would just go right on and just solve the cliffhanger straight away. But a more sophisticated technique is ending on a cliffhanger, like a slight or a major cliffhanger, then changing to another character. And you'd think it'd be really like, oh, but I want to find out what happens. But actually what happens is you get that like, oh, and then you want to keep reading, and it almost like slides you into the next character, because you're like, well, I have to get through this to find out what happened to that. But then you get absorbed into their story, and then the same thing happens, and you get sent back, and you're like, oh yeah, that was happening to that guy,
And then you get this like, near the end of the book, you can have this moment of like, it's like the great harvest, because all these tension points have been built through all the characters, and you're equally invested in all their storylines, and you're just like, every chapter is like, wow.
The Game of Thrones did that really well.
Yes.
The Game of Thrones.
Yes.
Yeah. You're like, oh, I don't want to begin this character thing, but you, like as Alex said, you come in with so much steam, it gets you into the setup for that character's problem, and now you want to find out what goes on with them.
Yeah, he's the goat at that. I think they've like multiple characters, and he'd like I it's been a while since I've read. I only read the first one, but I think he employs that same technique as you mentioned there, Phoenix, where he'll do tight on one character for a whole chapter, and then like use the chapter breaks to change, and he'll even have the name of the character up the top. Which is it's an elegant solution to changing character perspective, I think, and it's a structural solution as well.
Yeah,
it does that
as
well.
Who does
It by Stephen King? That classically does that, actually through 2 timelines, which is really clever. It's the first time I've seen that really done, and it's like a very, very clever way to do it.
It feels very cinematic to me. Like it's like you're building, and then there's like a car door shuts, boom, and you're like off to someone else, and I don't know, it's like a hammer cut, a hard cut to someone else. Meanwhile over here, and it just, I don't know, it feels nice to me. The opposite of when the tension's building so right across multiple characters is you do just get way more invested in a particular storyline, and anytime the chapter cuts to another character, you're just like, oh, okay, well, just gotta get through this one to get back to the story I care about.
That's the worst.
You hopefully avoid,
especially when that character is really boring or annoying. You're just like, oh, I don't care. Just go back to the other one, and they're just like, oh, why don't we sit down and get some apples, mustard, whatever? And you're like, no, I don't care. Get back to the wizard. Like, it's just...
I think that was classically Bran in the Game of Thrones series.
Oh, yeah.
You just turn the page and you just see the BRAN, and you're just like, oh, it's going to be like 10 to 15 pages of this kid sitting in a bed asking questions. It's just agonizing.
I mean, it's like a palate cleanser as well, so you can use it in terms of that. But Bran's chapters aren't great.
You need ups and downs to enjoy the ups.
You do.
It's true.
You can't just be full steam all the time.
If it's full steam all the time, like the reader can get exhausted sometimes. It's like too much. It's like, oh, I just need a break. Like, this is a lot.
If it's all steam, you get bored of the steam. There needs to be gaps between the steam.
Yeah. Well,
it's okay. We can edit it out.
Yeah. Thank you. With that, we'll start to close. Alex, would you like to read the quote?
I will read the quote, Phoenix. Absolutely. In the hands of a skilled narrator, words are not just ink on paper, but a gateway to the imagination, a portal to other worlds, and that is by Unknown.
Yeah, we don't know who said that, but if any of you do know who said that, you can let us know, and we'll credit them. The New Mythic, the anthology that we've all written, we've got stories in, twice nominated for an Aurealis Award, is available on Amazon. You can buy your copy now. I'm biased, but I think it's excellent. And
well, in fairness, you were one of the ones who were nominated. One of your stories.
The collection as a whole. But also there are some very unbiased, very objectively unbiased people who also think it's excellent, and they're the ones who nominated us. So anyway, that's on Amazon. You could buy it. If you're listening and you enjoyed this, do also leave us a review for this podcast. So you do that on Spotify, wherever you're listening. Leave us a review. 1, it helps people find us. It helps helps us with the algorithms and all that. 2, it makes us absolutely giddy, and usually when we get a comment, we share it in our chat, and we all think, wow, golly, how cool, and it makes our day. So feel free to share that. If any of you have comments on narration, any narration styles that you've seen, anything, any cool quirks, tips, whatever that you want to highlight, reach out with that as well. We'd love to see that. Or if you have any questions, reach out as well. We're happy, whatever. We just like to talk about this stuff, so reach out. Either of you have any other things, any other shout outs?
I would say just be careful with narration. Each different perspective that you choose, whether third person, first, the different kinds of third or first or second, if you want, they come with their own baggage, and they come with their own strengths and weaknesses. So it's not so much that one is better than one. You may prefer one over the other, but they all they're tools. They're tools in the armory, and in the tool belt, and you want to know when is appropriate to use those tools and how to use them. And the best way to do that is by experimenting with them. So just go and write a crappy story using a perspective you've never used, and see how it works for you. Or a good story, maybe, depending.
Yeah, or a good story.
You might just hit it. You might hit a home run straight away.
And with that, we'll close it down. Thank you for coming along on this journey of narration with us. I've been your narrator, Phoenix, and yeah, thanks for coming along. We'll talk to you later. Bye. End scene.
Noise.
You're listening to Prose and Cons, the Precipice Fiction podcast.